Hello and welcome to the Thought Cafe, where curious people discuss things that matter. I'm Julia and Suzanna, your host for this series.
And I'm Suzanna, and I'll be co-hosting this episode.
Today we're sharing our interview with Renée Hložek, a cosmologist and astronomy professor at the Dunlap Institute at the University of Toronto. Renée tells us about her work and research, as well as the advocacy she does to make science more accessible for everyone. She also shares insights about the challenges faced by women and minorities in the world of academia. First things first, I asked Renée to describe what she does as a cosmologist.
Cosmology is the study of the whole universe and what it contains, so the stuff in it, you, me, stars, radiation, planets, dark energy, dark matter, but also how it evolves. So actually we have a very surprisingly simple model of the universe. And if I can tell you what the universe contains now, I have a pretty good idea actually of how its future is going to look and actually what its past looked like. While I think stars and galaxies are very interesting and important, I don't study individual stars and galaxies. I don't care how they're feeling. I study how do they all work together? How do they cluster? How do they clump? What is their relationship to the space around them? How do the things in the universe change the way it behaves? I have two big collaborations that I'm involved in. One is the Atacama Cosmology Telescope. And these are telescopes in the Atacama Desert that measure microwave radiation, microwave light. And so the telescopes that we're looking at, so this is cold light in the universe that is coming from reasonably shortly after the Big Bang, so about 400,000 years after the Big Bang. And we measure the temperature of the light on the sky, and we also measure the polarization of the light, the degree to which the light is polarized. So sunlight we know is polarized, which is why we have to wear sunglasses, and the light from the CMB is also a little bit polarized, and both the temperature and the polarization tells us about what the physics was like at that time. So we're looking back billions of years and figuring out what is happening to the universe around the Big Bang and around 400,000 years after the Big Bang. And that's really exciting because we learn about that time, but also because the light has traveled so far to get to us, it actually interacts with other things. And so we learn actually, sort of as a secondary thing, we learn about the stuff in between, so galaxies and structures of galaxies. So that's telescope number one. And telescope project number two is under construction right now, also in Chile. So typically we build telescopes in cold, dry, deserty places, so either the South Pole or Hawaii, Chile. And so this is also in the Atacama Desert. And it's called the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, or LSST. And LSST is an optical telescope that's being built. So this is light that we would see with our eyes. And LSST will scan the sky very often. The thing that I'm looking for is actually stars that explode in the galaxy, because you'll see nothing yesterday and then today you see like a big bright object. And those exploding stars, which we call supernovae, actually tell us, they act like beacons of light, telling us how far we are to that object, because we can use the relationship of the brightness of the object to tell us the distance. That research is telling us about how the universe is expanding. And so what is driving that expansion, we think, is something which we call dark energy. And so we'll learn about dark energy. So with CMB, I measure the beginnings of the universe. And with LSST, I sort of measure the ends of the universe, which is a nice duo.
Renée makes it a big part of her career to discuss the issue of women in STEM, and not just women, but she wants to make it a more accessible space for everyone. And we'll hear her talk about what inspired her to do that, even as a young academic.
I'd like to change the conversation about how we engage with scientists and how scientists engage with us. Some people come up to me and they say, oh, I'd never understand what you do with your day, and you must be so smart, or something like that. And I feel that partly they're being kind, or trying to be kind, but partly it's our fault too, because we sometimes set scientists up as being on some pedestal. And I'm not saying I want to, pretend like what I do isn't interesting, or pretend that, I'm not intelligent, but I do think that making everyone curious, making everyone feel like more of a scientist is sort of what I see my role as. I never want to over-represent things, because there definitely were role models when I was a young person, but I didn't really know them. I had some profs at university and some high school teachers. But I didn't, other than Marie Curie, I didn't really know any women science role models. And if I did know scientists, there was a sense that the men were brilliant. And so I'd watch lots and lots of documentaries about these passionate men. It's just that there wasn't that with women. And the theme that I found was that they were successful despite their womanness, not either because of or independently of. Because I think it's important to talk about all the axes in which one can be different. So I like talking about, LGBTQ issues and women and gender. I think we need to have many more conversations about race. And I don't think that they need to be, this is bad, we need to always bring more people in, but also just highlighting these are the ways that scientists can look different. I like to try and think of breaking down some stereotypes that scientists have to be a certain way. My goal is to talk to people about being a scientist as the thing that you do, and then all the other parts that make you yourself, we should welcome, celebrate, and respect. But they don't have to be in competition. And I think that's a message I definitely didn't receive as someone growing up.
I find it really interesting how Renée talks about science. It's like you don't have to have parts of yourself that are in conflict to be a scientist. It's like, I think I always viewed it as like you're either artistic or you're scientific, right? Like you either go into art or science, but there is art that has room for science and there's science that has room for art. And there's so many branches of science. Like it's crazy how many roles and lines of work you can actually go into and how you can start to combine the two. It's like the Trappist piece we did, when we talked about music, using music and the orbits of planets to create sound. So it's really cool because I can consider myself a person who's into science and artistic and creative at the same time. They don't have to be in conflict with each other.
Typically, more senior women in the past had to deny womanness, and I'm not saying femininity, I'm just saying deny, fight all the barriers. And so they sometimes have I'm a scientist, don't speak to me about women in science stuff. I'm a scientist only, that's the only thing that matters, which I think is fine, and they're entitled to that. But for me, that's not enough because I don't want to ignore this axis of this degree of freedom if we're going to use sciencey speak. One thing that I don't do is, and in fact, I recently had to embarrass someone who was asking me questions, but they started then asking me about my family life. And I said, I'm happy to talk about personal things. I have no problem. I blab all over the internet all the time, but I'm not going to answer a question that you don't ask a guy. So if you're asking me if I'm married and I have kids, that's not appropriate until I see that we're asking guys these questions. And people say, and people don't really. People ask guys these questions. So it's the case of I want to highlight the fact that we're different and that I'm a woman, but I don't want to highlight only the things you associate with womanness, right? And I think that is something that as a community we have to sort of get better at. So I think it's okay for everyone to be a human and to talk about the ways in which we are humans and scientists, but I want to make sure that we don't just do the girly, sparkly, do you think it's easier for you to do organizational stuff because you're a woman? That stuff has happened to me. Do you think it's easier to have a group because you're a woman? I'm like, no, it's because I'm a human that pays attention to feelings. And I know lots of men that do that too. And they also sometimes can feel like they have to put on some version of male bravado or machismo or whatever to pass for a male scientist. So everyone is hurt when we do these very stereotypical gender stuff.
So then Renée gets into some of her experiences with harassment and, mistreatment, discussing power dynamics, which is something that is so important to consider across the board, let alone in her field of work. And it's probably, I think, the most hard-hitting part of her whole interview and discussion. I think in the piece, the animated piece as well, this was the part that definitely got to me the most.
Some challenges have been, throwaway comments. So I said, I'd love to be a prof. And someone said, oh yeah, that's fine for you because you don't have to be the breadwinner. And I was like, what? That wasn't even, it's one of my lectures, but that kind of comment that gets made a lot. And some people at various stages suggest that you are there because you are a woman. That's very difficult because on some level, I think that's true. And on some level, I think that's good. So, when then people say to you, oh, but you're not as qualified as a guy, that gets a little bit harder. And then it goes from that level of stuff to slightly, more damaging stuff. Sexual harassment, I've had quite a few instances of like profs doing things or, colleagues doing things and people saying things, which has been, pretty damaging. And I think one of the reasons why it's so destructive is because there's a lot of shame around it. And so a lot of the things that I think happened, I didn't recognize initially, or I thought they were more my fault, as opposed to someone saying like, no one does that. That shouldn't be happening. And I think that would make a big difference to try and encourage people to feel like they're all part of the community, right? You shouldn't feel like you're only part of the community unless you get a professor that hits on you, because that's your fault. You shouldn't have to select a group to make sure that you're with someone that you think will not find you attractive, which I know colleagues have said, like, I'm going to pick working with this person because I'm pretty sure he's not going to hit on me, which is a terrible, terrible indictment of the field.
Given everything that Renée has learned through her path and how far she's come in her career, I was really curious to know what she would tell her younger self, what kind of lessons she would impart to her younger self.
I think the thing I would tell myself is that a few things. So the first is that just because, and it sounds so silly to say, but it's true, but like just because you wear, sparkly eye makeup or have boobs or whatever, I don't know, doesn't give someone the right to do that. Even if, you don't have to change yourself to stop harassment happening. Someone has said this to me when they were harassing me. They said, oh, tonight I'm just a guy. And I was like, if you can't see the power dynamic between us, the difference, then, I have no respect for you, because I wouldn't do this. I know now, and this was when I was a student, I know now I wouldn't do this because you aren't just a guy. You're in a huge position of power and you have power over my career. So I cannot make the same choices that I could. The careers are tied together. So even now, if I openly was to sort of tell people the names of the people that have harassed me, they could still damage my career. And I'm a tenure-track professor, right? So I totally understand people who don't want to speak up. But of course, if you don't speak up, there's nothing we can do. And so we're in this terrible catch-22 of victims that have intense pressure to say nothing, universities and institutions that support harassers openly, blatantly, and then it just creates this intense feeling of helplessness that I really want to fix. And so I'm trying to speak to people, young women, about partly just, if it doesn't feel okay, it's not okay, because that was never told to me. But the other thing I would tell myself is that you may not always understand power dynamics. And if there's a power dynamic, it really is the onus of the person with more power to be mindful of that. And I think, a lot of the time you can be, when you're younger, you can be, confused by power dynamics. And I have to think of this, and I'm not even talking only in sort of sexual harassment terms.
This next part of our interview with Renée was definitely my favorite, because she gets to the bottom of what is so problematic in the academic world, and not just how it pertains to harassment, but she is able to connect all the dots between a culture of rudeness and then how that feeds into the culture of harassment and silence. And I just really think this part of our interview was brilliant, and that more people need to look at all these things as being connected instead of talking about them independently.
So I joke that my job is to have ideas, but then to destroy them. And that's really important. And it's a skill we train students, and I train students all the time. This is what you do. You basically just tear everything down, and then if it survives, you build it up again. But the problem is that we then do that to each other. And there's sort of an understanding in science that that's accepted, right? So I'm not actually saying that we should stop that, because you are actually supposed to logically pick apart people's ideas. I think in science, the idea is that if I can be as aggressive, then I can show you that I'm smarter than you, because I'm basically showing you that You believed your lies, I don't believe your lies, and this is why. And so it starts to build a culture of rudeness, of interrupting. So you don't even get to tell me your whole idea because I decide I see the flaw in step 2 and I just trash you, right? And the crazy thing is that it starts to become seen as a sign of intelligence. So it's like the opposite. Instead of saying someone's, a rude person, you say, oh, but it's because they're so brilliant. They shouldn't have to play by the same rules because they're so brilliant. And so it's very interesting, we talk about like online harassment and the like Twitter arguments, right, which devolve. But some of that behavior I see in science, which means you're never surprised, you're never really listening, you're always smarter than everyone else, and you rise because you're seen as this great person. Of course, it makes a terrible person to work with, right? A terrible colleague because you have to deal with that all the time. But I hear these kinds of things, like they get a pass because they're a genius. That is said in my field. If the goal is to get more scientists in, and all I'm doing is finding the aggressive people who sometimes are wrong, right? They're not always correct at step 1 or step 2. But students look at this happening and they never want to speak because they think, oh my God, I'm going to be found out to be a fraud. It starts building imposter syndrome stuff. No one wants to speak out. And it's this terrible cycle that is difficult to break. And a lot of it's just sort of accepted in the field. And that's the thing that I'm really trying to change but I just think we create a culture that prioritizes brilliance over humanity. And I am tired of that.
As we do with all of our guests, I asked Renée what her hopes are for the future.
I would love a future where being a scientist was an exciting thing, but not a remarkable thing. That young boys and girls saw themselves as scientists the way they see themselves as lawyers. I would love to be in a world where students feel really comfortable enough because they know that they're supported and protected. Someone posted on Twitter the other day, they said, imagine how much more you could do if you didn't have to worry about harassment or, someone taking a grudge because you're a woman or something. Like, imagine how much more science you could do. And so I see the future as students who, 15 years from now, that they don't even think of these things. And then, maybe we'll figure out what dark matter is at the same time. And I think it's possible. I just think we have to work as hard at this as we did at first year calculus. And I think if we just do that, we can figure it out.
Thank you to Renée for joining us and to you for listening. Make sure to head to the Thought Cafe YouTube channel to watch the animated version of this interview.
And make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on future TC Plus episodes.